Before we begin, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more life-changing stories like this, and comment where the late October sun dipped below the horizon as Marcus Jackson stepped into the sprawling chaos of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport on a brisk evening in 2025. The terminal thrummed with restless energy, suitcases clattered against tile, voices overlapped in a frenetic hum, and garbled intercom announcements crackled overhead. At 34, Marcus moved with a soldier's steady gait, his broad shoulders bearing the weight of a faded green duffel bag etched with the scars of his final tour in Afghanistan. His army uniform, freshly pressed despite months of dust and sweat, hugged his frame, the medals pinned to his chest glinting faintly under the harsh fluorescent lights. Dark circles shadowed his brown eyes, but a quiet pride lifted his chin. After years of service, dodging mortar fire, burying comrades, and surviving nights that stretched into eternity, he was finally coming home. In his calloused right hand, Marcus clutched a first-class ticket, its crisp edges a small rebellion against the exhaustion gnawing at his bones. He'd hesitated before buying it, the cost gnawing at his practical side. Tasha, his wife, had urged him to splurge just this once. "You've earned it, baby," she'd said over a staticky video call, her voice a lifeline through the desert nights. He pictured her now, her warm, dimpled smile, and his 6-year-old daughter, Aaliyah, with her braided pigtails and gap-toothed grin, waiting for him at Houston's George Bush Intercontinental Airport. That image propelled him through the crowded concourse, his boots thudding softly against the floor, each step a countdown to home. The first-class lounge loomed ahead, its plush seats a beacon of respite. Marcus's tired eyes scanned the space, landing on a woman seated near the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the tarmac. Charlotte Grayson was impossible to miss. Her tailored navy blazer and gleaming Louboutin heels screamed old Texas oil money. Her platinum blonde hair swept into a severe updo that matched the sharpness of her blue eyes. A Louis Vuitton handbag sat possessively on the seat beside her, its monogrammed leather a silent claim to the territory. At 42, Charlotte carried herself with the haughty assurance of someone born into privilege, her gaze sweeping the room like a rancher surveying her herd. Marcus barely registered her at first. He'd met her kind before, from dusty outposts to stateside bars. He judged people by their deeds, not their designer labels. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and polite, as he stopped before the seat next to her. "I believe that's my spot." Charlotte didn't respond immediately. Her eyes flicked over him, his dark skin, the uniform stretched across his broad chest, the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Her lips pressed into a thin, skeptical line, and her posture stiffened as if his very presence was an affront. "Are you sure?" she drawled, her Texas twang sharpening the condescension in her tone. "This is first class, you know." Marcus's jaw tightened, a flicker of heat rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Yes, ma'am, I'm sure. This is my seat." Charlotte leaned back, her manicured fingers tapping a staccato rhythm on the armrest, her nails clicking like a predator's claws. She studied him again, her gaze narrowing as if searching for a crack in his story. "Well, I just find that hard to believe," she said, her tone deceptively light but laced with venom. "You must have gotten lost. This section's for first-class passengers." The air thickened with unspoken tension, a silent storm brewing between them. Marcus took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing calm into his veins. He'd faced insurgents who'd spit in his face, commanders who doubted his grit. This was nothing he couldn't handle. Still, her words cut, their implication as old as the dirt he'd marched through. "No mistake," he replied, his voice firm but measured. "I have a first-class ticket, and this is my seat." Charlotte's lips curled into a smirk, and she cast a quick glance around, as if expecting a security guard or fellow passenger to swoop in and validate her disbelief. When no one did, she let out a dramatic sigh, her shoulders lifting in mock exasperation. "Forgive me for being skeptical," she whispered, her voice loud enough to carry, "but it's just not what I expected." Marcus's eyes darkened, a shadow crossing his face. He knew exactly what she meant. Not his service, not the medals, but the color of his skin. It wasn't the first time he'd been sized up and dismissed, and it wouldn't be the last. Before he could respond, a flight attendant approached, her curly hair pulled into a tight bun, her smile tight and cautious as she sensed the brewing conflict. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice hovering between professionalism and unease. Charlotte pounced like a coiled snake. "I think there's been a mix-up," she said, her tone dripping with indignation. "This gentleman seems to think he belongs in first class, but I find that highly unlikely." Marcus handed his ticket to the attendant without a word, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. She scanned it, her eyes widening slightly as she read the seat assignment. 1B, right beside Charlotte. "No mistake," she said, her voice kind but firm, handing it back with a respectful nod. "This is Mr. Jackson's seat." Charlotte blinked, her composure faltering for a split second before snapping back like a steel trap. "Well, I find that very unusual," she muttered, her words a pointed barb meant for Marcus's ears. The attendant forced a strained smile, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I assure you, ma'am, everything's in order. Mr. Jackson, please take your seat. We'll board soon." Marcus nodded, his face a mask of calm as he stowed his duffel bag in the overhead bin, with the precision of a man who'd packed for survival more times than he could count. He settled into the plush leather beside Charlotte, the cushion sinking slightly under his weight. She shifted away, her discomfort palpable, her body angled as if to erect an invisible wall between them. Her hostility radiated like heat off a Texas highway. But Marcus turned his gaze to the window, watching planes taxi across the tarmac. He willed himself to focus on Tasha's laugh, Aaliyah's tiny arms around his neck. Anything but the woman simmering beside him. After all he'd endured, Charlotte Grayson was a gnat buzzing in his ear. He'd swat her away with silence. The tension didn't dissipate as they boarded American Airlines, Flight 1423 to Houston. The first-class cabin hummed with the soft clink of glassware and the rustle of newspapers as passengers settled in. Marcus sat by the window, his broad frame filling the seat, his hands resting lightly on his knees. Charlotte, beside him in 1A, crossed her legs tightly, her designer heels tapping in impatient rhythm against the floor. The hum of the engines vibrated through the cabin as the plane taxied toward the runway, but Charlotte's restraint unraveled like a frayed rope. She turned to him, her voice sharp as a switchblade. "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" she snapped, her blue eyes boring into him with undisguised disdain. "I mean, this is first class." Marcus met her gaze for a fleeting moment, his brown eyes steady, then returned to the window, watching the ground crew scatter like ants below. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, calm but unyielding. "I'm sure," she scoffed, folding her arms across her chest, her gold bracelets jangling faintly. "I don't know how you manage this," she muttered more to herself than to him, "but there's got to be some mistake." Her words hung heavy in the air, thick with racial undertones she didn't bother to mask. Marcus's grip tightened on the armrest, his knuckles whitening beneath his dark skin, but he held his tongue. He'd learned in the army to pick his battles. Insurgents with rifles were worth the fight. Charlotte Grayson was not. Not yet. But Charlotte wasn't done. Her frustration boiled over, and she waved down the same flight attendant with a flourish, her manicured hands slicing through the air. "Excuse me," she called, her voice cutting through the cabin like a whip, drawing the eyes of nearby passengers. "I need you to check this man's ticket. There's been a mistake. He doesn't belong here." The attendant, her name tag read Jasmine, approached with a weary smile, her eyes darting to Marcus with an unspoken apology. "Ma'am, I've already checked his ticket," she said, her tone professional despite the strain. "He's in the right seat." "That's impossible!" Charlotte's voice rose, a shrill edge creeping in as heads turned in their direction. "There's no way he paid for this. Check it again." Marcus handed over his boarding pass once more, his movements slow and deliberate, his face an unreadable mask. Jasmine examined it, her fingers trembling slightly under Charlotte's glare, then nodded. "Everything's correct, ma'am," she said, handing it back to Marcus. "This is Mr. Jackson's seat." Charlotte's face flushed crimson, her lips parting in disbelief. "This man doesn't fit the profile of someone who flies first class," she hissed, her voice low but venomous, her words slicing through the cabin like a blade. "I don't know how he got here, But you need to fix this now. The cabin fell silent, a heavy stillness settling over the rows of plush seats. Marcus felt a surge of anger flare in his chest, raw and molten, threatening to spill over. He'd faced worse, shouted slurs in basic training, sidelong glances in mess halls, but this stung differently, here in the supposed comfort of first class. He glanced around, catching the eyes of other passengers. An older couple exchanging uneasy looks, a businessman peering over his laptop, a young woman with earbuds pretending not to listen. Some shifted uncomfortably, others stared in quiet outrage, but none spoke. Jasmine straightened, her tone hardening as she stepped between them. "Ma'am, I need you to stop harassing Mr. Jackson. His ticket is valid. He has every right to be here. If this continues, I'll involve the captain." Charlotte's mouth snapped shut, her eyes blazing with indignation, but she sank back into her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She glared at the headrest in front of her as if it had personally betrayed her. Jasmine returned Marcus's ticket with a soft, "I'm so sorry, sir," her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes brimming with sympathy. He nodded, exhaling slowly through his nose, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. The storm had passed, for now, but Charlotte couldn't let it go. As the plane climbed into the night sky, the city lights of Dallas shrinking below, she muttered under her breath, her voice a venomous hiss. "This is ridiculous. I didn't say anything that bad. People are so sensitive these days." Marcus turned to her, his eyes hard, his voice quiet but cutting like steel. "You didn't ask a question," he said. "You made an assumption." Her eyes widened, stunned by his directness, her mouth opening to retort. For a moment she seemed poised to strike back, but his words landed like a blow she couldn't dodge. "Well, excuse me for being surprised," she snapped, her voice trembling with defiance. "I don't usually see—" He cut her off with a raised hand, his palm broad and steady. "You don't need to explain," he said, his tone calm but unyielding. "I know exactly what you meant." His words hung between them, heavy with the weight of a lifetime of such encounters, and for once Charlotte had no comeback. She turned away with a loud, exasperated huff, her shoulders rigid, her silence a grudging retreat. Marcus shook his head faintly, turning back to the window. The stars glittered against the black expanse, a stark contrast to the chaos beside him. He'd dealt with her kind before, people who cloaked their prejudice in polite smiles and barbed questions. He knew better than to let it burrow under his skin. Tasha's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't let him steal your peace, Marcus." And he clung to it, determined to make it through this flight with his dignity intact. Unbeknownst to either of them, a silent witness had observed the entire exchange from 3 rows back. James Carter, a Houston-based tech mogul and philanthropist, sat quietly in 4B, his casual jeans and polo shirt belying his stature. At 52, James carried the quiet authority of a man who'd clawed his way up from Houston's 3rd Ward to a corner office downtown, his sharp brown eyes missing nothing. He'd boarded late, slipping into his seat with little fanfare, his carry-on tucked beneath him. But Charlotte's escalating tirade had pierced the hum of the cabin and drawn his attention. At first, James had watched with mild curiosity, assuming it was a petty seating dispute. But as Charlotte's words sharpened, her disbelief morphing into naked prejudice, his stomach churned with a familiar disgust. He'd seen her type too often. People who wore their entitlement like a crown, who believed wealth or status made them untouchable. It was a mindset he'd fought against his entire life. First as a kid dodging bullies in the projects, then as a black entrepreneur breaking into a world that rarely welcomed him. Through his Carter Foundation, he'd poured millions into veterans programs and minority startups, driven by a belief in resilience and redemption. Charlotte's arrogance was the antithesis of everything he stood for. But it was Marcus who held his gaze. The soldier's restraint, his refusal to let Charlotte's venom provoke him, spoke of a strength James recognized. A strength forged in fire, tempered by years of proving himself in a world quick to judge. James had wanted to intervene, to stand and call out her bigotry, but something stopped him. Marcus's dignity, his quiet resolve, was a force of its own. This wasn't James's fight to steal, not yet. Instead, he watched, his mind turning over possibilities, a seed of determination taking root. Around them, other passengers bore witness in silence. The older couple in 2A whispered to each other, the woman's brow furrowed with disapproval. The businessman in 3C lowered his laptop, his jaw tight, but he didn't speak. A young woman in 5B, Mia Torres, a UT Austin student heading home, slipped her phone from her pocket, her thumb hovering over the record button. She'd hesitated, her heart pounding, but Charlotte's words, "doesn't fit the profile," tipped the scale. She pressed record, the lens capturing every cutting syllable, every measured response from Marcus. The plane touched down at Houston's George Bush Intercontinental Airport with a soft jolt, the engines whining as they slowed. The cabin stirred with the rustle of bags and murmurs of relief, the long flight finally over. Marcus stood, his muscles aching from hours of tension, eager to leave Charlotte and her venom behind. She rose too, gathering her handbag with a swift, practiced motion, her final glance at him cold and disdainful, as if his silence had been surrender. To her she'd won, unaware of the man she'd dismissed, a decorated soldier who'd given years to a country that still, too often, refused to see him. As Marcus stepped into the terminal, the humid Texas air hit him like a wave, loosening the knot in his chest. He inhaled deeply, tasting freedom, the promise of home so close he could feel it. But before he could take another step, a voice called out, firm yet warm. "Excuse me, sir. Marcus, right?" He turned to see James Carter approaching, his handshake firm, his smile genuine beneath a neatly trimmed beard. "James Carter," he introduced himself. "I was on the flight. Saw what happened with that woman? Charlotte, was it?" Marcus nodded, his expression wary, his duffel bag still heavy on his shoulder. "Yeah, what can I do for you?" James's eyes softened, but his tone carried weight. "I was impressed. The way you handled that, it takes real strength. Most folks would have lost it, and no one would have blamed them." Marcus shrugged, brushing off the praise with a faint twitch of his lips. "I've dealt with worse. Wasn't worth the energy." "It was more than that," James insisted, stepping closer, his voice lowering as travelers streamed past. "I run a nonprofit, Carter Foundation. We support veterans and minority entrepreneurs. After what I saw, I think you'd be perfect for a role we've got. Can we talk?" Marcus blinked, caught off guard, his mind still half on Tasha and Aaliyah, waiting beyond the glass doors. "What kind of role?" he asked, his voice cautious but curious. James gestured for him to walk with him, leading the way through the terminal's bustle. Leadership, mentoring vets, transitioning out of service, guiding small businesses. You've got the grit, the heart. I saw it back there. You didn't flinch. The offer landed like a grenade, unexpected and jarring. Marcus had planned to take it slow, to soak in the quiet of home after years of chaos. "I just got back," he said, his boots scuffing the tile. "Was hoping to spend time with my family." "I get that," James replied quickly, his hands raised in understanding. "It's not full-time. Flexible hours. You set the pace. But the impact, huge. Think about it. Mentoring guys like you, fresh off the line, helping folks build something of their own." Marcus's brow furrowed, the idea stirring something deep, a chance to keep serving, differently. "What kind of impact?" he pressed, his voice steady but intrigued. James's eyes lit up, his passion spilling over. "We've got a program for vets finding their way, guys lost in civilian life, needing a voice like yours to guide them, and grants for minority businesses, real cash, real support to get them off the ground or scale up. You'd be a beacon they can trust, Marcus." The words sank in, tugging at a part of Marcus he'd thought he'd left overseas, the part that thrived on purpose, on lifting others up. He shifted his bag, considering. "All right," he said after a long beat. "I'll hear you out." "When?" "Tomorrow," James grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. "Our office is downtown off Main Street. No pressure, just come and see what we're about. Bring your family if you want." They shook hands, James's grip firm and warm, and as Marcus turned toward the exit, a spark of purpose flickered in his chest, faint but growing. Beyond the glass doors, he spotted Tasha, her curls bouncing as she waved, and Aaliyah, her braids swinging as she danced in place, clutching a handmade sign, "Welcome home, Daddy." The sight erased Charlotte's shadow, and for the first time that day, Marcus let himself smile, a real, unguarded grin that reached his eyes. The next morning, Marcus stepped into the Carter Foundation's sleek Houston office, a modern building tucked between skyscrapers on Main Street. The lobby greeted him with warmth, walls lined with photos of veterans shaking hands at job fairs, shop owners cutting ribbons in front of new storefronts, kids beaming at scholarship ceremonies. James met him at the entrance, his easygoing smile a steady anchor, and led him to a conference room where a small team waited, their faces a mix of curiosity and respect. The meeting unfolded like a revelation. A program manager, a wiry woman named Carla, outlined their veteran transition initiative: job training, counseling, a mentorship network. "We've got guys coming home lost," she said, her voice earnest. "They need someone who's been there, who gets it." Another team member, a young man named Malik, detailed the minority business grants, seed money for Black and Latino entrepreneurs, paired with workshops to navigate the grind. "We're building legacies," he said, his eyes bright, "but we need leaders to show them the ropes." Marcus listened, his arms crossed, his mind racing. He saw himself in those vets, disoriented, searching for footing after the structure of service fell away. He saw Tasha's dream of opening a bakery, stalled by loans and red tape, in those entrepreneurs. By the meeting's end, James turned to him, his expression hopeful. "So what do you think?" Marcus leaned back, his chair creaking faintly, then nodded. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "This feels right." James clapped his hands, the sound echoing in the room. "Welcome aboard, Marcus. You're going to move mountains." In the weeks that followed, Marcus threw himself into the work with the same intensity he'd brought to the battlefield. He met with vets in a cramped community center, their stories of struggle and hope mirroring his own. Men like Jamal, a former Marine haunted by nightmares, who found purpose in a carpentry course Marcus pushed him toward. He sat with entrepreneurs like Rosa, a single mom with a food truck dream, guiding her through grant applications until her first check arrived. The work was tough, grueling hours, raw emotions, but it filled a void he hadn't known was there. A new mission where his victories lifted others up. But the story didn't end there. Back on Flight 1423, Mia Torres, the UT Austin student in 5B, had made a choice that would ripple far beyond the cabin. Shaken by Charlotte's brazen prejudice, she'd hesitated before posting her video online, her hands trembling as she typed the title. "First-class bigotry caught on camera." She'd captioned it simply, "This isn't okay. We need to talk about this." Within hours, it exploded across X and TikTok, racking up millions of views, the hashtag number, first-class racism, trending like wildfire. Comments flooded in, a tidal wave of outrage and awe. "This man's a hero, and she treated him like trash. Disgusting. How is this still a thing in 2025? Shame on her. His calm is unreal. True strength right there. Airline needs to ban her. Permanently." News outlets pounced, digging into the footage frame by frame. They identified Charlotte as Charlotte Grayson, a senior VP at Grayson & Hale, a Dallas-based oil marketing firm with deep roots in Texas's energy elite. The backlash hit like a Category 5 hurricane, flooding the company's social media with demands for action. "Fire her. Your silence is complicity," until their accounts drowned in fury. CEO Laura Hale faced a crisis she couldn't duck. In a tense boardroom meeting, she paced before her execs, her heels clicking against polished wood, her face etched with strain. "We can't sit on this," she said, slamming a fist on the table, her voice tight. "Our silence looks like we're defending her." An exec, a balding man in a pinstripe suit, leaned back. "It'll blow over. These internet storms always do." "No," Laura snapped, her green eyes flashing. "Our brand's built on integrity, Texas values, family values. We've got clients watching, shareholders breathing down our necks. We act now, or we're hypocrites." After a heated debate, voices rising, papers rustling, She drafted a statement, her pen slashing across the page. Grayson and Hale condemns Charlotte Grayson's actions. They violate our core values of respect and inclusion. Effective immediately, she is terminated. The news broke like thunder, and Charlotte's world imploded overnight. She arrived at her sleek Dallas office the next morning, her usual strut faltering as her access card failed. Security escorted her out, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the marble floor. "It's a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice shrill with panic, her blonde hair slipping from its perfect updo. "They're blowing this out of proportion." But her pleas fell on deaf ears, the glass doors closing behind her with a finality that echoed in her chest. Publicly shamed, her social media besieged by vitriol, she retreated into obscurity, her once pristine life unraveling thread by thread. Meanwhile, Marcus's grace under fire made him a reluctant icon. The video showcased his composure, his steady voice, his unbowed dignity, and the Carter Foundation seized the moment. They launched an anti-bias campaign with Marcus at its heart, filming him in their Houston office, his uniform traded for his simple button-down. In the viral clip, he spoke plainly, his deep voice resonating. "What happened on that plane isn't unique. People like me face it daily, microaggressions, assumptions. But we've got a choice. Let it break us or turn it into fuel for something better." Donations poured in, a flood of support that stunned even James. Hundreds of thousands in days, enough to expand veteran programs and double business grants. Marcus found himself thrust into the spotlight, invited to speak at conferences and events across Texas and beyond. At first, he balked at the attention, preferring the quiet of his work to the glare of fame. But Tasha urged him on, her hand squeezing his. "You've got a voice, Marcus. Use it." At a Dallas Equity Summit, he stood before a packed auditorium, the mic amplifying his steady cadence. "That day was one moment," he said, his gaze sweeping the hushed crowd. "But it's part of a bigger fight. We've got to face our biases. Call them out, fix them. Not just for us, but for our kids." The room erupted, a standing ovation shaking the rafters, and Marcus felt the weight of their hope settle on his shoulders. Not a burden, but a call. Months later, an unexpected twist emerged. Laura Hale, now Chief Diversity Officer at Houston-based Lone Star Energy, approached Marcus after a Carter Foundation meeting. She'd left Grayson and Hale after the scandal, driven by a need to do more than issue statements. "Your story changed me," she said, her handshake firm, her auburn hair catching the light. "I wanted to be part of the solution, not just react. But there's something else, Charlotte." Marcus tensed, his jaw tightening at the name. "What about her?" he asked, his voice low, the memory of that flight flickering like a bad dream. Laura sighed, her expression a mix of resolve and unease. "She's barely scraping by. Minimum wage jobs, no prospects. That video's a ghost that won't leave her. I'm not excusing what she did. It was inexcusable. But I can't help wondering if there's a way to turn this into something positive." Marcus frowned, his arms crossing over his chest. "You're serious?" "Hear me out," she pressed, stepping closer, her voice earnest. "What if we gave her a chance to make it right? Not a PR stunt, real work. She goes through our diversity program, digs into her biases, then shares her story. A warning, a lesson. It could show redemption's possible, not just punishment." The idea gnawed at Marcus, stirring old wounds and new possibilities. Charlotte's words had cut deep, her disdain a slap he'd felt in his bones. Yet he'd seen men change, soldiers who'd stumbled, then stood taller. Could she? He wrestled with it for days, pacing their Houston duplex as Tasha watched, her eyes soft but probing. "What's your heart say, baby?" she asked one night, her hand on his. "Forgiveness," he admitted, his voice rough. "But it's gotta be real. She's got to earn it." He called Laura, agreeing with conditions. Charlotte had to commit fully, months of workshops, not a quick fix, prove her change through actions, and use her story to teach others the cost of prejudice. Laura nodded over the phone. "She'll do it, or it's off." Laura tracked Charlotte to a rundown Dallas apartment, its peeling paint and sagging porch a far cry from her former Highland Park penthouse. The woman who answered the door was a shadow, hollow-eyed, her blonde hair limp, her tailored blazer swapped for a faded hoodie. Why help me? Charlotte rasped, suspicion lacing her voice as she clutched the doorframe. It's not a trick, Laura said, her tone gentle but firm. It's a chance to learn, to grow. But you'll have to face what you did. Really face it. Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes, her bravado crumbling. I've lost everything, she whispered, her voice breaking. My job, my friends, my life, all because of one stupid moment. If there's a way out, yes. Charlotte dove into the program like a woman drowning. Workshops on privilege, raw discussions about race, books that tore her worldview apart. It was brutal. She stumbled, her defensiveness flaring like a cornered animal. At one session, she snapped, "I'm not a monster," only to falter as a facilitator. A soft-spoken black woman named Denise asked, "Then why'd you act like one?" The question broke her, tears streaming as she faced the mirror of her actions. Slowly she softened. She read Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram X. Kendi, her notes sprawling across cheap notebooks. She listened to vets and entrepreneurs share their stories, their voices echoing Marcus's quiet strength. The turning point came when she faced him in a stark conference room at Lone Star Energy, her hands trembling, her eyes red-rimmed. "Marcus," she began, her voice shaky but resolute, "I was vile that day, arrogant, cruel, blind. I didn't see you, not the soldier, not the man. I saw what I wanted to see, and I'm so sorry, more than I can say." He listened, his face impassive, his hands clasped on the table. When she finished, he leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "What's changed?" he asked, his voice low, searching. "Everything," she said, tears spilling freely now. "I've learned how blind I was, my privilege, the hurt I caused. I thought not being racist was enough, but it's not. I have to fight it every day, challenge it in myself, in others. I'm not there yet, but I'm trying." Marcus saw the shift, not perfect, but real. Her arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, fragile humility. "This isn't the end," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's the start. You've got a long road ahead." "I know," she nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'm ready." Their unlikely alliance bloomed into a powerful program. At their first joint session, before a packed room of Lone Star employees, Charlotte stood at the podium, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "A year ago, I was that woman, smug, prejudiced, entitled," she began, her eyes scanning the crowd. "One moment on a plane exposed me, and I'm still ashamed. But I'm learning to see, to listen, to change." Marcus followed, his presence a quiet force beside her. "Her words cut deep," he said, his voice strong and clear. "I've faced that kind before, on bases, in streets, in my own country. It's exhausting proving you belong. But that day lit a fire. We can't just endure this. We have to change it. Together." The room erupted, applause thundering as employees rose, some wiping tears, others nodding in resolve. Their story spread. Schools invited them. Corporations booked them. Headlines hailed them. One night after a searing presentation at a Houston community college, a young man approached, his voice trembling. "I've judged people like that. Quick, stupid. You made me see it, and I want to fix it." Charlotte smiled faintly, her eyes soft. "That's why we're here." Later, over coffee at a dimly lit diner, she stirred her mug, her voice thoughtful. "I thought that video ended me. Now it's my purpose, showing people they can mess up and still come back." Marcus nodded, his gaze distant. "Funny how life turns. I just wanted to get home that day." The climax came unexpectedly at the Carter Foundation's annual gala, held in a glittering Houston ballroom. Marcus and Charlotte shared their journey, their voices weaving a tale of conflict and redemption that hushed the crowd of donors and dignitaries. As applause faded, James took the stage, a glint in his eye, his tuxedo crisp against the spotlight. "Tonight's special," he said, his voice booming. "We've got a surprise." The lights dimmed and a screen flickered to life. Aaliyah appeared, her braids adorned with tiny beads, her smile wide as she stood in her school's auditorium. "My daddy's a hero," she said, her voice clear and proud. "He fought for us overseas, then here, kept his cool when that lady was mean. And Miss Charlotte, she messed up bad, but she's helping now. That's what heroes do. Lift people up, even when it's hard. The crowd gasped, then cheered, a wave of sound crashing through the room. Marcus's eyes welled up, his breath catching as he stared at his daughter's face, her words piercing his heart. Charlotte clutched his arm, sobbing quietly, her nails digging into his sleeve. Off stage, Tasha leaned into James, whispering, "She begged to do this, her gift to them." On stage, Marcus pulled Charlotte into a brief, fierce hug, a soldier and a sinner, bound by a shared journey. "We're not done," he said, his voice thick with emotion, cracking under the weight. "Not by a long shot." James joined them, raising a glass. "To Marcus and Charlotte, proof that grace can heal, that change can grow from the ashes. And to Aaliyah, who reminded us what it's all for." The room rose, roaring, as the screen faded to the Foundation's motto, "Strength in unity, change through grace." But the night wasn't over. As guests mingled, a figure emerged from the shadows. Jamal, the vet Marcus had mentored, now in a crisp suit, a carpentry business card in hand. "Couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice rough, handing Marcus a small wooden box, a hand-carved gift for Aaliyah. Marcus opened it, revealing a tiny soldier figurine, its face mirroring his own. "She'll love it," he said, his voice breaking, pulling Jamal into a backslapping embrace. Across the room, Charlotte watched, a tear-streaked smile on her face as Laura approached. "You did it," Laura said. "You turned it around." "No," Charlotte replied, her voice soft but firm. "We did, and we're just starting." Outside, Houston glittered under a star-strewn sky, a city touched by their story, a testament to resilience, redemption, and the unbreakable power of second chances. As Marcus drove home, Aaliyah asleep in the back seat, Tasha's hand in his, he glanced at the box on the dash. Charlotte's apartment light flickered on miles away, her pen scratching across a journal, vowing to keep fighting. Their journey had sparked a movement, proving that even the ugliest moments could birth something beautiful, a legacy of grace, etched in wooden words, rippling far beyond that fateful flight.